Okay, what I want to do is talk about the first chapter of Genesis specifically. I've been working on that chapter for over 40 years.
Hmm.
We'll talk about a lot of other issues that relate to the first chapter of Genesis, a lot of outside is what people would think are outside issues. But everything actually that is written about in Christianity, it all comes down to the first chapter of Genesis.
Hmm.
Actually, the first letter of Genesis, then it goes to the first word, then it goes to the first two verses, then the first chapter, and then you got the entire Old and New Testament that are commentaries on this one chapter. Specifically, it's a commentary on the first letter of the Bible. Now, you may ask, how can the whole Old and New Testaments be a commentary on the first letter of the Bible? Well, that's precisely what it is, because God only utters one letter, not let one letter, but just makes one utterance, and the
Hmm.
whole universe came into being. Now, the way I discovered this was in piecemeal over a 40-year period. It doesn't come to you all at once. And one of the greatest mysteries of the Bible, which the Jewish people, or the people that wrote the Bible, which I believe were Christian, they wrote the Old and New Testament, um, but they may not have been called Christian back in those days when they were creating the Judeo-Christian scriptures. But if you understand the esoteric nature of the Bible or the first chapter of Genesis, you would understand that it had to be Christian minded people that wrote it.
Hmm.
But the Jews understand that if you study the Bible, really study it, the gematria value of words, the numerical value of words, and study the message numerically, letter by letter, not word by word. Word by word is what they call the revealed, meaning that there's three Torahs. There's the revealed, what you read, then there's the covered, that's what is secretly hidden in the letters, and then there is what they call the hidden.
Hmm.
So there's three different Torahs for you. I can talk to you about the hidden, the revealed and the hidden, but I can never talk to you about the mystical nature of the hidden, because the hidden is only what you as an individual can embody.
Hmm. Hmm.
If that makes any sense, that's the mystical nature of the Bible, the mystical word of God.
Right.
So, for example, let me talk about the first letter of the Bible. You look at the first letter of the Bible, and you'll see that it's Bet, Beth. But what most people don't know, if you go to the Hebrew um, books that talk about the 22 letters, you'll see that the letter Bet and the letter Pei are interrelated, because Pei inundates and surrounds the letter Bet. And you don't see the letter Pei in that first letter of the Bible.
Hmm.
Think of the first page of the Bible as a blank sheet of paper. And what you got up in the corner, right hand corner, because the Hebrew is written right to left and English is written left to right.
Right.
Well, the Hebrew is going from east to west, and the English is going from west to east.
Right.
Well, if you look at that one little letter, pay, bet, you'll know that pay inundates and surrounds it, but you don't see that. So that means the whole page is symbolic of pay. It represents, pay is symbolic of the moon. It has a
Okay.
geometric value of 81. 81 is 9 times 9 is 81, which is the kamiya of the moon. Whereas bet, its spelling is bet yad tav, and yad, Y-U-D, is symbolic of the sun,
Hmm.
where Alex is the symbolic of the moon. And this is symbolic of the ego consciousness and the unconscious mind, that when they come together, they create Christ consciousness.
Hmm.
And that's what the whole Bible is about, the interrelationship of the sun and the moon, or the ego and the unconscious mind. Now, I know that most people don't know that the Bible talks about the psyche, but
Hmm.
that's all the Bible talks about is the soul. And this, when the soul comes into the world, it splits into the two-part psyche. And it's you, the individual, that has to know yourself. You have to know the ego is Satan, basically, unless you can somehow get it to coincide or combine with the unconscious mind.
Hmm.
Most people don't even know the unconscious mind exists.
Hmm.
Well, anyway, to continue on to, let's say, the first chapter of Genesis, to show you what I'm talking about how the mystery of the mysticism is in the first chapter of Genesis. I happened to notice that there was 32 times that the word of God is mentioned in the first chapter of Genesis.
Interesting.
So in these first three pages, first three images, I color-coded the word God in yellow. Both in Hebrew and in English, I colored them yellow. So these are the 32 times on all three pages. Then you turn around and you look at each time the word God is mentioned, it has an associate word. It has like God created, or God made, or God saw. And I color these in different colors because 10 times God said, S-A-I-D, which means desired. God desired. Then there are 7 times God saw, 3 times God made, and then there's 12 other words used variously and are called elementals. Now, I just gave you the same pattern that has been known for 2,000 years as belonging to the Kabbalistic tree of life. In 2,000 years, I know that the Jewish people knew that the Kabbalistic tree of life was in the first chapter of Genesis, like Rabbi Aaron Kaplan, which I got the idea initially from his book. But what they don't believe in is images. And so they would never have thought of an image in the Bible. Whereas I am a Christian and I believe in symbolism, I looked for the symbolism and I found it. And so what I did was they took these 32 Elohims and I put them into a circle sequentially. And you'll see that I list the 32 Elohims and this associate word in image 4. And in image 4, you'll see 2 of the 32 Elohims are kind of shaded out. It's great. Well, Rabbi Kaplan made a mistake in his book. What he did was call the first one, God created, he called that a sephira. And he called God desired, or God said, as an elemental. Yeah. So you got to ask yourself, how is this possible that he can call, well, I changed it to God, the 31, the 31st Elohim. I changed that back to to a sephira, and I changed the first one back to an Elohim. And when I did that, it popped out right in front of me when I put the 32 Elohims in a sequential cycle in image 5, in JPEG 5. You can see that I color coded it into the different categories of the Kabbalistic tree of life. So now you turn to image number 6, and you'll see where I have earmarked the 10 sephiras in black dots. But I draw a line from one to the next of 4 sets that are 180 degrees from each other, literally 180 degrees. And when I turned around and did that, I literally embellished the framework of the Kabbalistic tree of life. So as you look in image number 7, you can see I completed the Kabbalistic tree of life. And this is called, the Kabbalistic tree of life is called the natural array. It's called in Jewish parlance the Gaz tree, where the Kabbalistic tree of life with a tail is called Ari's tree.
Okay.
So the Gaz tree is the natural that comes directly from the Bible. Now, I'm a believer in demonstrable evidence, so I would not think of the Aries tree because I have the natural array directly from the Bible. I don't need somebody's made-up image, if you understand what I'm saying. But both these Kabbalistic trees of life have the same amount of Elohims, or 32 paths.
Sure.
So then you go into image number 8, and you will notice that the elementos, that 6 of the elementals pair off into 3 sets, 3 pairs, 180 degrees from each other. And when I marked those off, paired those off, I found the Kabbalist, the Star of David, and it comes into the cube of space. If that makes any sense to you. So Then I began to study what I'm looking at. I studied these 32 images, and when I did, I began to look at the first 4 days of creation, which has the first day of creation has 31 words. The second day of creation has 38 words. They combined in a number of ways, but this is interesting. That 69 is like a Tai Chi symbol of the yin yang, of opposites, and it's deliberately set that way because the third day of creation has 69 words. The fourth day of creation has 69 words. So 3 times 69 is 207. Well, in the first day of creation, when it says that God separated the light from the darkness, the word light actually has a gematria value of 207. So actually the Bible interprets itself by telling you that the first 4 days of creation represent the light. So when you separate the 32 Elohims into light and darkness, and you look at the aggregate of 3 to 18, you'll get 168. Well, the aggregate of 1 to 32 is 528. And when you turn around and you go for the diameter of the circle of 528, what do you get? 168. So you see, they even incorporated the formula for pi into that circle. And it even gets even more mystical when you realize that the word God, the word Elohim, in the Bible, when you do the gematria value of each of the letters of the word Elohim and break it down, you go from the number 3 and go counterclockwise, and you'll come up with the formula of pi, 3.1415.
Interesting.
So you see that they did this deliberately. Then you take the aggregate from 19 around to 32, and then the first 2 verses, and the aggregate is 360, which is 360 is a circle.
Right.
So you see what they're doing? Each letter of each Elohim is a circle and designated as pi, and then they took the whole 32 Elohims and they turned that into a circle, and with pi in the center of it. It even gets more interesting. You'll see that in a few minutes. But when you go up that diameter of the circle in this circle of 32 Elohims, what you do is you look at the categories of the Kabbalistic tree of life in just the first 4 days of creation, and you break it down into the categories, and then you total the numbers. 48 for Sephiros, right? 48 for double letters, 48 for single letters, 24 for mother letters. That's 3.5, as in 3.5 coils, Kundalini circle, the dormant Kundalini serpent, and it goes straight up that central column, that of the diameter of that circle. And all of this is right here in the first chapter of Genesis. Now, that's incredible that nobody has seen that in all of these years. Or maybe they saw it, but they didn't write about it explicitly. And there's a reason for it. The tradition is you don't talk about the covered. You only talk about the revealed. But what the Catholic Church has been doing for the last 2,000 years, or the first 1,600 years, was that they talked about these things explicitly in their symbolism, in their artworks, like the Sistine Chapel. I wrote a 484-page book on the Sistine Chapel, a study in celestial cartography. Now, that was the image 9 we just talked about, that circle of 32 Elohims. Now go to the 10th image, and you'll see that here I have the Hebrew alphabet. And literally, the Hebrew alphabet and the numbers are all brought forth in a 10 by 10 matrix. We'll get to that 10 by 10 matrix as we go along. I just wanted to introduce it here. We go to image 11, and what you'll see is the word Bereshit. And as you can see, I color-coded it red and green. Green is for the letter Resh, and the red is for the letter Bet. Well, the first 2 letters of the Genesis, or the Torah, is Bet, and then you got Resh. Those are the first 2 letters. Well, when Bet and Resh come together, they form the word Bereshit. Well, here I got in my hands a book. It's called the Zohar. I got the whole set of 23 volumes. In the first set, of this Zohar and the prologue, which I've had a number of different sets over the years, 5 volumes, 3 volumes, but always in the prologue, it talks about how the alphabet came before the Lord of the world, which is Yahweh,
Mm-hmm.
and asked that it be used as the conduit for all of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, and they go from the last letter to the first.
Mm-hmm.
So, for some reason or other, Yahweh or Yud finds a reason not to use any of the letters. He excuses them, oh, you're too good, or your letter is used in evil, so we won't use you. And it continues on down to the second letter of the alphabet. And finally, he chooses Bet, and Aleph is behind him. He's using the Ten Commandments. But the reason why I tell you this is because it has everything to do with this first word, because that's where that mythological story comes from, that mythos of that the alphabet comes from. And I accidentally discovered that because, and you'll see in a minute why. But let me go on to image 12. I'm showing you image 12 only because we talked about pi separating the light and darkness.
Mm-hmm.
Pi is God, the Elohim. In the, in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, there are 9 central panels. Michelangelo painted the ninth first of North, and he went up to the first, to the altar, where above the altar is God separating the light and the darkness. Well, as you can see with this picture, God, if you look at him as pi, you'll have light on one side and darkness on the other. He did precisely on the ceiling what I discovered in the first chapter of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted that image there for your viewers to see that. And then we go on to image 13 and 14, which are images of Serpent Mound in Ohio. This Serpent Mound is an effigy that was created by the American Indians over 2,000 years ago. And there's a reason why I talk to you about this Serpent Mound. Serpent Mound sits on top of a yardang inside of a gigantic meteor impact crater.
Mm-hmm.
It sits on just the edge on the inside, just like I told you that Bet sat inside that on the top right hand corner of a huge white sheet of paper. The whole page is infinity, just like that impact crater, that meteor impact crater represents the whole of creation. Now, when they did a Vimeo of the landscape that this Serpent Mound was on, which got rid of all the vegetation, and they're just looking at the land, dry land without vegetation, I happened to notice something that all the expert academics never saw, was the fact that the whole of the yardang, not just the serpent effigy, the whole of the yardang that stretched out was in the image of a sleeping bear, which happens to be the most symbolic image of the American Indians. They worship that sacred bear as very spiritual. And it's coming out of the bear's mouth as if the kundalini is rising out of the head of the bear, the kundalini serpent. Now, the reason why I tell you this is because surrounding that yardang with the Serpent Mound on it are 12 other sites, 12 zodiacal cycles, which a guy named Ross Hamilton wrote a book on. It's beautiful to see it. And there's a reason why I mentioned the zodiac, because it's going to be a good part of our discussion here. But indicating that how did the American Indians know the precise thing that we were seeing, that was actually codified into our sacred scriptures?
Mm-hmm.
See, all over the world, everybody does it independently. Nobody borrows from somebody else. Right. If they borrowed from somebody else, they would do it precisely the same way. But one thing I noticed about mysticism around the world, no matter what culture it is, nobody copies from anybody else, right? If they do it, they have to use the same materials, and you'll see what that major material is in a minute, but they have to do it in their own way. They have to create their own artistic understanding of the Word of God. All that we're talking about, the alphabet, colors, art, all of that, that is just our way of expressing the Word of God.
Right.
There's no way of actually teaching anybody the Word of God. I can show you this alphabet. I can show you the sacred geometry. I can show you all of this artwork and teach you symbolism. But there's no way you can understand what that symbolism says unless you are spiritually gifted. Like, one of the things between Christianity and Judaism is that they are symbiotic. When the Jews talk about studying the Bible and they get blessings, that's the secret of the whole secret of the Bible. When you really study it honestly, trying to find out what life is all about, you get a blessing from God. Most people don't because they're not sincere. Right. The one person you can't fool is yourself. So you can't lie to yourself. You got to be truly honest with yourself, and that blessing will come. Well, what Christianity is all about that blessing. Like Christ says in the on the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are you. He's talking about himself. You have received Christ if you're the poor in spirit. You know what I'm saying? Right. So that's precisely what Christianity is. But the problem with Christianity and the difference between Christianity and Judaism is constantly pounding on that granite rock. And what is the granite rock? The Bible is the granite rock. Your ego is the granite rock. You got to constantly humble yourself and lower yourself in order to receive this blessing. Because if you don't, you'll never receive it. Mm-hmm. And you'll do be reading the surface text, or you'll be looking at maybe you do understand this sacred geometry, but that doesn't mean you're going to get a blessing. Right. That doesn't mean you're going to get a spiritual understanding from the Holy Spirit of God. And believe me, that Holy Spirit is there. You literally feel it all the time, mm-hmm. as if you're getting helping hands all the time, helping you understand what you're looking at. Now let's go to image number 15. There in image number 15, you'll see I took the word Bereshit and I put it into the circle. And the reason why I did that was because in the book, the Zohar, as I said, it's 23 volumes, it talks about Bereshit, the 6 letters of Bereshit, representing the 6 directions. Well, I took that seriously. So I said, well, if Bet is the first letter and it has the numerical value of 2, that would mean that Tav, the last letter, must be 2, because it comes through the conduit. That means the diameter of the circle is 4, the circumference is 12 point, and goes out decimally. And then what is the surface area of that sphere? And I came up with 50.26. Mm-hmm. Well, there's only whole chapters, whole verses, whole words in the Bible, so you can't have fractions thereof. So there's 50 chapters in the Bible. I said, well, that may be coincidental. Let me see. Then I looked at the volume of said sphere, and it came to 33.51. Well, that stunned me right away when I saw that, because if you took the decimal out and reversed that number to 1533, 3351 switched it to 1533, that's precisely how many verses there are in the 50 chapters of Genesis. All of that is codified into the first word of Genesis. Wow. Not only that the first letter of Genesis is 2, Bet. Pei, which I told you inundates and surrounds it, is 80. So Pei is 20% of that whole, well, you could say it's 82, but it'll break down. Lowest common denominator is 10, and 2 would be 1/5. So 20% of 100. If you turn around and you did, well, there's a law in the universe which was discovered by the Voyager, the 2 Voyager probes that went out and mapped the solar system back in the 70s. Mm-hmm. Well, they discovered that on every orb of the universe, whether it be the planets, the sun, the moon, there is scarring on the moon, there is sunspots on the sun, right. There are vortexes on Jupiter and Pluto, there is scarring on Mars, even on Earth, on the Hawaii and India, you got the volcanoes. So at 19.5 degrees of the axis poles, you'll see this. Well, the Bible can only deal with whole numbers, as I told you. So it'll go to the nearest whole number, which is 2 or 20. So when you multiply 1,533, multiply it by 195, you'll get 299. Well, 299 happens to be at the very end, the last verse of the 11th chapter of Genesis. The 11 chapters of Genesis is the antediluvian times, and anything from the 12th chapter on is called modern times. Anywhere in academia will say that. So you can see that what was the welling up welling forces coming up out of Genesis in the 12th chapter of Genesis. Upwelling of forces in all these planets, creating these scarring, these vortexes, the sunspots, the volcanoes. Well, you'll see that Abraham is pulled out of the land of Earth, his father's home. So he's the upwelling of forces. And then you go on. But I wanted to bring that law of the universe, and I wanted to show you that it was codified into the first book of the Bible. So now we're going to go on to the next image, which is 16. And here is what I call the Genesis formula. This I discovered because I followed the what the Zohar told me to do. It turns around and it takes the alphabet. The alphabet goes into creation, right? And those that are rejected go back out of creation. So if you look at the word Bereshit, you'll see that 400, 300, 200, or Tav, Shin, Resh are the high cosmic numbers. Whereas if you look at the three lower numbers, you'll see that there's Yud, there's Aleph, and there's Bet. And these are lower numbers, two archetypal numbers and one transitant number. Why I'm showing you this is that I had the idea of going out and saying, okay, what happens if I have all the alphabet coming in and the alphabet going out? And so what I did was to go to and create the pattern that was equal on both sides. And when I did this, I come up with 10 numbers. And when I began to study it, as you can see with this image, the vesica piscis sits on the 4 ones, right? But it creates a pattern that you'll see in a minute creates other images, and I'll tell you why that's important. But I just wanted to introduce that there. Here in the 17th image is you'll see the pyramid complex with the face of a pharaoh with the falcon behind him. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this about the Giza Plateau is you take the word Bereshit and look at the first 4 letters in Genesis formula that's coming into creation. There's Tav, there's Shin, there's Resh, and there's Quat. These 4 letters literally spell out the word Christ in Greek using Hebrew letters. Now, I didn't come up with that. That was a Jewish scholar that mentions that in the mystical nature of the English language. And in his introduction, he talks about this. He said he wanted to go to his Hasidic rabbi and talk to his rabbi and tell him about how the word Christ is in the last 4 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So he figured he'll get a hell of a reprimand from his rabbi. He said when he told his rabbi this, instead of getting a reprimand, he saw his rabbi's face went pale. He literally was stunned and went pale when he saw that Christ was literally written into not only the first word of Genesis, but in the last 4 letters of the Hebrew coda. Now you see why I'm beginning to see that it had to be Christian people that wrote the Old Testament. Not only that, look at the first side of this image 16, and you'll see that Bet does not go to the next image, which is the needle, Quad, right? What did he say in the New Testament? He said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. If you look at the Trinity aspects of the Imperium there as heaven, Bet, as the rich man, cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. But look who went before Quad. It's right. Gimbal is sitting there, the camel. The camel had gone through the eye of the needle.
Right.
So you can see where that New Testament phrase came from. That New Testament phrase from Christ's mouth comes directly from the first word of Genesis. See how the New Testament is beginning to become a commentary on the Old Testament.
Right.
So what I did with those six letters of Genesis, I took the three big ones, and the three big ones would be Ta, Shin, Resh, and it came to the second large pyramid. The three small ones came to the I can't even pronounce that word, but the small pyramid. Then you have the three tiny pyramids by it. Those are the six letters, and then they create these here large pyramids. And even the largest pyramid, the Great Pyramid, has the letter quad, the fourth one, which creates the word Christ. You'll see it in that image. Now, why do I have the Pharaoh's head there? The Pharaoh's head with the falcon behind it, because when you get that last letter into the first word of Genesis, how do I get that last letter in as the first word of Genesis? Because the letter Pei that inundates and surrounds Bet, when you add these two up, Pei is the 17th letter, Bet is the second letter. The two come together, that's 19.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, quad, number 100 here in the cosmic numbers, is the 19th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So literally, when you gain Christ consciousness or Horus consciousness, you create the Trinity in the first letter and the first word of Genesis. Because Elohim and Yahweh are two aspects of the Trinity, and then you got Christ. And when Christ says, when you see me, you see the Father. Mm-hmm. So the Trinity is right there in the first word of Genesis. You can do that by doing more study. Many people will not see this unless they do the detailed study themselves, and they discover it. Now, just by following my example of how I'm doing it is not going to teach you very much. Mm-hmm. What will teach you something, or really be very good for you, if you make discoveries on your own. And there's literally thousands and thousands of nuances that I have not seen that other people will see.
Let me ask you this, though. Is the Zohar, the 23-volume Zohar that you have, is that probably one of the best references to do further research into what we're discussing today?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. I've stayed on Genesis. I haven't gone too far beyond Genesis. But I would say, yes, the Zohar, it's the only one, a really good one in English, even though other people are now coming out with more volumes. And they were expensive. When I first bought it, it was almost $600. I think they now have it down to about $200.
Okay.
But image 18 is another picture of the Pharaoh with the falcon behind it. When you look at the Pharaoh, John Anthony West had that as one of his films in Magical Egypt, and he shows the Pharaoh straight on. You can't even see Horus consciousness behind him. But now take a look at that word Genesis again that I've just talked to you about, the Genesis formula. The reason why I have it there is because what is quad? Behind it actually says needle there, yes, but it also means back of head, right? Mm-hmm. Look at race. What does that represent? Race represents head. Mm-hmm. Shin represents tooth. Tav represents the mark on the forehead, or the snake that comes out of the Pharaoh's head. So I understood that to be the head of the Sphinx. Mm-hmm. You understand what I'm saying? So you can understand when I see this picture of Pharaoh with Horus consciousness behind him, the falcon behind him. That's precisely what it's talking about. Who wrote Genesis? It had to be it not only had to be the Hindus, it had to be with the Greeks. It had to be with the Egyptians. I believe that what happens with the Jewish people and the Christian, what's the difference between them? What we call Kabbalists and the Jewish religion, I believe they are basically likened to Christians because they understand it on a symbolic level. Whereas most Jews are Orthodox, and they're like the Protestants that only read the Bible literally. They don't read it on a symbolic level. Mm-hmm. Where Catholicism is 100% symbolism, and that's the Word of God, symbolism. If you read the Bible word for word in the Mickey Mouse story on top, then you're not getting anything. It's actually a destruction of the Word of God. Just reading it like that. Saint John and Moses both talk about this in the Bible when they said, don't add or take away from the Bible. And when you turn around and translate the Bible, you're taking away the numerical aspects and symbolic aspects of every single letter in the Bible. Whereas when the Greeks wrote the New Testament, they took with it the numerical values and the symbolic values into their letters.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you see gematria values in the Greek New Testament. And they are symbiotic, you might say,
Mm-hmm.
because they both need each other. I can show you a gigantic Kundalini serpent image in both the Old and New Testament. And maybe we can get to that later.
Yeah.
But right now we go to the image number 19. Here you can see the large letters going left, going west, whereas the lower letters going back out of creation,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's where I initially got the idea of the Genesis formula, right there. But remember the Vesica Pisces. That's probably one of the most important symbols in all of the Bible. It's the fact that the two opposites, materialism and spirituality, coming together,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
We go into image 20 and 21. The image 21 is Christ on the cross, and he has the good and bad thieves to the left and right of him. That alone creates a Vesica Pisces image. Now look at the Catholic Church, St. Peter's Basilica, on image 21. And you see that the two fountains coming around the obelisk, and it creates the Vesica Pisces. The very same Vesica Pisces you saw with the light and darkness. All you saw was one aspect of the circle. Actually, there's a second circle that you don't see, because that, like he said to the one thief on the cross that repented, he says, today you'll be with me in heaven. Well, that's why you only saw one circle in the first chapter of Genesis, because the other circle didn't deserve to be in heaven with Christ. But that's beautiful image, because that whole thing there, if you study the first chapter of Genesis, you'll see that image adds up to 888, which is the number of the Lord Jesus Christ. The same circle there in St. Peter's Square does the same thing. Now notice that there are exactly 140 statues on top of these two colonnades, beneath these colonnades. You'll find out that there's 13 more statues on top of St. Peter's Basilica. That totals to 153. 153 is the aggregate of 17. 17th is the 17th letter of the Hebrew coda, is Te, which represents the 100. Remember, he says, Peter and the disciples, throw your nets into the sea. And when they pulled them out, they pulled out 153 fish. Well, basically, that's it. That center of those two circles is the Vesica Pisces, which is 153. It's amazing how this symbolism is taken by the Catholic Church and put into artistic form. Now, notice the obelisk. How tall is that? That's 82 feet high. Pei is 80, Bet is 2, 82 feet. You see how the symbolism is brought forth into the real world, into the manifested into Christ symbolism. That church is created in an octagon shape, that St. Peter's Basilica. We'll get into that in a minute. But the octagon shape is taking the Temple of Jerusalem, of the Jewish temple, which is rectangular, right? And you turn around and morph it into that octagon shape, which is the Christian church, right? But remember when I told you about the Christian church, is that as soon as you get Christ, he's dead. He now has to rise from the dead and start his ministry over again. As soon as he comes, he dies again. Every time Christ comes, he's crucified. You got to crucify him, because life will not continue unless you constantly pound on that granite rock, the Torah. Because God doesn't let you sit on your laurels and be, oh, I discovered this. Let me make $1 million and live in peace. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
You can lose that $1 million tomorrow earning it today if you don't do your job. And your job is to learn all about you and God. And it's you and God. It's not you and the congregation. It's not you and the fellowship. It's you and God. Now, that's going to be hard for many people to understand, because you got that charismatic person up on the pulpit telling you his point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And he rarely reads the Bible, because if you listen to what he says, he's always making mistakes. You know, you don't listen to another person. You don't follow somebody. You're supposed to be a pioneer all the time,
Right.
not some of the time. You don't sit back and rest on your laurels. I'm sorry I'm sounding so tough here,
It's okay.
but that's the way mysticism is. It's
Right.
the toughest thing in the world. You want to love God, you want God in your heart, then work for it, earn it. And that's the way. You want respect, well, earn it. And that's what mysticism is all about.
Mm-hmm.
Image 22. Now, it shows you Chartres Cathedral, not Chartres, yeah, Chartres Cathedral. The west portal, above the portal central door, is this image of Christ in the center of a vestic of Pisces. Notice below, again, I have the two circles in the Genesis formula. That's precisely what Christ is. He is the center of the vestic of Pisces.
Mm-hmm.
He is the sole importance of all creation. And a lot of people don't understand it. Have you ever heard of Chartres Cathedral?
Yes, actually, I think I've seen this image before. I've done a lot of traveling throughout Europe, actually, in among other places. But this image looks very familiar, and it's interesting when you said Vestica Pisces previously. Now I actually see it perfectly here. They didn't complete the circles, of course, but I see it right there in the middle now.
Yeah. Okay. Let me give you a little history of Chartres, because most people don't understand the mysticism of Chartres Cathedral,
Okay.
which is the greatest mystical cathedral the church has ever built. People don't go back to 1020, when Chartres Cathedral was first being built in a Romanesque style. See, they always go just up to the Gothic aspects of the cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
But unless you know about the Romanesque and the fires that took place,
Mm-hmm.
you can't possibly understand the mystical nature of the church. 1020, there's a fire. So Bishop Fulbert starts building this gigantic Romanesque cathedral, Chartres Cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a fire in 1134. And only the west facade survives. Can you imagine Can you imagine the whole? No, I'm sorry. Only the cathedral survives, and the west facade burns down. Okay, in 1134. So they had to recreate the west facade. Now imagine what they built in the west facade in 1134. The whole of their plan was to do a commentary on the west facade.
Okay.
That was the eventual plan. You burn down the old paganistic way of life,
Right.
and that's what the old west facade represented. You didn't burn it all down, but you begin to burn it down. And what the west facade in 1134, those few years they built it, it represented that spiritual vision that comes to you through God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had that vision in 1978. And what happens, I told you about the first two letters of Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
Bet, and I told you about Resh, coming together, and they form the word Bereshit. Well, when you come into life as a baby, God sends you into this world a spiritual being. And all you got to do is look at a child in the first few years, and you can see that that child is acting like he's playing with spiritual beings.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, over time, the child loses that spiritual sheen and is educated into the ways of the world.
Right.
So basically, his spirituality has been shattered,
Mm-hmm.
because he has to be educated into the ways of this world. He has to be baptized into the ways of this world. Now, I guess eventually he realizes he has to try to regain that spirituality. Let me tell you a story about how in the Walden schools, I happen to know people that go there, and I know teachers there. And I was told this story about this young girl and her sister, and they thought the young girl was going to do damage to the young sister, so they had to watch over her. So they had her in a room all by herself with her little sister,
Mm-hmm.
just to see why this little girl kept going after her little sister. I think the girl was 4 years old. The little sister was even younger. And the little girl finally goes up to her, "Well, do you still know God? Because I'm beginning to forget all about God.
Hmm.
Do you know God?" How does a little girl, 4-year-old girl, say that to her younger sister?
Mm-hmm. That's
But
amazing.
it shows you that those children, when they come in, they have that spiritual sheen in them.
Right.
But so what happens is that when you finally do get you have that raison d'etre all your life, and you don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
You pick this. Oh, I love alcohol. I love smoking. Oh, let me test those drugs,
Mm-hmm.
and you get all these addictions in life, whether it's drugs or alcohol or sex or gambling or whatever it is, but that you're enamored by in this world. It brings you down into the bowels of hell.
Mm-hmm.
Because you know anything about addiction, how bad it gets. It keeps getting worse and worse and worse as the years go by. Okay, now you have the West Facade. Now, all of a sudden, in 1194,
Mm-hmm.
there's another fire,
Wow.
and the whole of the church burns down, and only the West Facade now survives.
Wow.
Can you imagine
Hmm.
that? What are the odds?
Right.
First, you have the West Facade burning down, the whole of the church stays intact. Now you have the whole of the church burning down in the West Facade. Then, and when that happened, they says, well, the Virgin Mary's veil
Mm-hmm.
still survived. Well, the veil of the church was the West Facade.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes any sense. It's the symbolism of the church. It's the West Facade.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they built the Gothic cathedral behind it. But now look at all those fires in 1020, 1134, 1194,
Mm-hmm.
right? You had all these fires. Well, that fire represents you going into the church and studying, and that fire is faith. You have to have faith in what you're studying is true, and they are the fires burning down. Example of this is in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy.
Mm-hmm.
In Purgatory, chapter 27, it talks about how Virgo and Dante have to go through this wall of flames to get to the other side. In order to get to the other side, and Virgo is constantly pushing the memory of Beatrice onto Dante.
Mm-hmm.
Think of Beatrice, think of Beatrice. And they finally get through the wall of flames. Well, that wall of flames are those fires in the Chartres Cathedral
Mm-hmm.
that burned down. Was all that Romanesque was how difficult it is for you to get through that granite rock to those messages that are in.
Right.
You'll be surprised how many interpretations the first word of Genesis will give you if you constantly study it, constantly go at it, constantly be that granite rock. You will see dozens of interpretations. But how can one word, one letter give me all those interpretations?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the whole of the Old and New Testament are thousands of vignettes telling you the same story told to you in different mythologies.
Right.
And you think, oh, these are all different stories, the Jewish history and Christian history. No, it's one small vignette telling you how God spiritually hits you and how you change your life through the search for God. And you say, well, thousands of vignettes telling me the same story. But all those nuances teach you different little things about your soul. Now let's go to the page, the number 23, where you see Washington Monument. And look at the bottom on the ground. Again, the vestic of vice is going around the George Washington Monument. Well, in 2004, they have pictures of 2004 of the Washington Monument, and it's just a gigantic circle. You don't have the vestic of vices. This picture, I think, was taken in 2007. So somewhere between 2004 and 2007, this image was made. They remember all that scaffolding that went up the Washington Monument?
Right.
Well, when they did that, that was the sledge of hand. Because as they were doing that, they were creating the work on the ground. You see, they watch out what they may do to the Capitol building. And what changes they may make that most people will not notice. You have to look for it. But they're going to make changes that they're not going to tell people what they're doing.
Right.
I wrote a 63-page paper on the Great Seal of the United States. And I talk about George Washington's apotheosis on the Capitol building ceiling. And I talk about the geometry in the streets. Now, you may have seen films. You may have read books on this so-called sacred geometry in Washington, D.C. I don't touch any of it. I touch only what I discovered.
Right.
And I wrote 63 pages showing as I said, the Great Seal of the United States, the apotheosis, Washington, D.C., and all these designs in the streets. Did you know that the lettering of the streets go north to south, where the the alphabet goes from horizontal, whereas the lettering goes vertical? That's what I'm showing you here. You
Mm-hmm.
got the letters going vertical, then all of a sudden, boom, from north to south, you get race. The
Mm-hmm.
race is the beginning, and that's division. And then the diagonal streets, then they create words for the diagonal streets. So you can see what the Masons are doing. The Masons do the work of John the Baptist, whereas Christianity, they believe in perfection of the Word of God. Be you therefore perfect, even as God in heaven is perfect. Whereas the Masons show you how to come to perfection. But they don't stay there because they know they have to keep studying, keep studying, keep studying. But whereas Christianity's, they're caught in that one loop, and
Right.
they can't seem to get out of it. That's why most ancient saints studied the Old Testament
Mm-hmm.
to see. But the only way to get at Christ, and Saint Augustine is the one that got me to it, about studying the letters and the alphanumeric structure.
Mm-hmm.
We're now going to come to image 2024. Now, image 24 is again the Genesis formula. But now you take the Genesis formula and you put it into a circle. And when you do that, look how it creates the Kabbalistic tree of life in a
Mm-hmm.
natural array. Do it again, take the two fours and break them up into two deuces, and you get the Star of David right dead center to the circle. Now you say, well, that's something you're making up because you broke up the fours. Well, yes, I did. But if you look at the calendar that you have on your wall, and you look at the 12 signs and the 12 months, there's 4 months with 30 days, and it creates a butterfly pattern, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just as you see 3 butterfly patterns here in this image here. Well, the other two, the other 8 signs create 2 more butterfly patterns. When you put all 3 butterfly patterns together, it creates the Star of David. Now, what does the Star of David symbolize? Well, remember I told you about all the orbs in the galaxy at 19.5 degrees
Mm-hmm.
of the axis poles? It creates the tetrahedral forces in creation. Well, these two tetrahedrons coming together create the tetrahedral forces in creation. That's the tetrahedral forces in your psyche coming together,
Mm-hmm.
which creates creation. Everybody thinks creation exists outside the envelope of their body. Actually, nothing exists beyond the skin envelope.
Uh-huh.
Not even the skin envelope exists. But the point is, you live your whole life between your ears.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody thinks they live it out there. And there's nothing out there. It's a blank abyss, the
Right.
world. But they don't know it.
Right. Right.
Now, image, then you have the crown of creation.
Mm-hmm.
That's where Rabbi Kaplan made his mistake. He knew about the tradition of Keter, and he thought the first word of first time Elohim is mentioned, he thought that was the Sefer Keter. But I showed that by taking all 10 letters and putting them in circle creates a crown of creation,
Mm-hmm.
which is only when the 19th letter comes into the first word. That's extraordinary that the first word of Genesis, not only the first letter, not only writes the first word, but if you study each and every letter of the word Bereshit, it writes the first 2 verses of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
When you study the first 6 days of creation, it is written by the first six letters of Bereshit. Remember I told you that it was 69, 69, 69 in the
Mm-hmm.
first 4 days of creation? Well, in the first 4 chapters of Genesis, there are 1,449 words. When you divide 207 into 1,449, you're going to get 7 light chakras. And if you look online about the small light chakras, minor light chakras, you'll find out there's 21 minor light chakras.
Mm-hmm.
So 69 times 21 is 1,449. So you could see how these ancient ones, they were codifying everything they could into the same symbolism, using the same symbols. It's the same. Anyway, now let's go to image number 25. Now this is the single most important symbol in the history of the world. You may think otherwise, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
I accidentally discovered this matrix. I was doing the mathematics on Dante Alighieri's La Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy,
Mm-hmm.
and I broke his mathematical system in a very few months. I think within 12 months or 2 years. But it took me 12 years to come up with that image of this cycle, of that matrix.
Mm-hmm.
And I call it the matrix of wisdom now. I gave it a number of names over the years, but finally the matrix of wisdom, because I think that's what the Bible is talking about. When it talks about wisdom, Solomon wanted wisdom. This is what he wanted. Because out of this 10 by 10 matrix comes the whole of all the sacred scriptures in all the world. In fact, it's the world that you live on.
Mm-hmm.
You ever heard of Aladdin's carpet?
Yeah.
Well, this is the carpet of Aladdin,
Mm-hmm.
because you never get off this carpet until, of course, you die, and then you'll come back again anyway. But the point is, this is the matrix, and I'm going to show you examples of it as we go along. But what this matrix is basically it's the multiplication table is casting out nines.
Mm-hmm.
Is to take the last column of each multiplication table and put them side by side, and you create the first 9 multiplication tables, and then I add the 19. Remember, you add quad, QOPH,
Mm-hmm.
the 19th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, add it to it, and you got the Christ consciousness. This is the Garden of Eden,
Mm-hmm.
and this is the world that you should be living in. Let's go to the next image, 26. In 26 here, I try to show that the first line of this matrix is what it is when these two sides of this matrix come together in unity, right? They create the first word of Genesis, Bereshit. So if you study that image, you'll see that.
Mm-hmm.
We go on to number 27. Number 27 is again the matrix of wisdom, but here I put the zodiac calendar year. Now you say, how do you know that these signs of the zodiac belong in these particular spots? Well, I know the center belongs to Pisces, Gemini, Aries, and Taurus, simply because our entire Bible is based upon those 4 signs of the zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know this? It's because the Bible goes back not to 4004 BC, as Bishop Ussher says, because if you go back to St. Augustine and begin to read his works, he'll tell you that, he says, well, you can't believe all these people about history that believes that the history of man goes back 6,500 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
which in his day put the beginning of creation back to, well, not back to 6,000 years BC, not to 4,000 like Bishop Ussher. So you see they have different dates, different times. I'm thinking more in tune with Augustine, and Augustine didn't even believe that. He thought it went back millions of years too.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, we can't believe these historians that believe it only goes back. So Gemini would be over 6,000 BC. And then you got Taurus, Aries, and Pisces. And the New Testament is the beginning of Pisces. And if you read the Old Testament, they talk about the bull, of the burning, the worshiping of the bull, and the burning of the ram at the altars. You understand what I'm saying?
Correct.
So they're these equinoctial signs, the procession of the equinoxes. That's what those 4 represent. The first 2 verses of Genesis represent Scorpio and Sagittarius. Now, between Scorpio and Sagittarius is the Cygnus, the Cygnus constellation, the Northern Cross.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that Northern Cross is extraordinarily important because I told you about how Bet and Resh come together. When Resh comes down and smacks the hell out of Bet, which is the ego, and splits it apart, Bet has to split open and allow Resh in. Mm-hmm. Well, that's coming vertically, crossing the horizontal, creating the cross. And when you study the first word of Genesis and it writes the first 2 verses of Genesis, you can see that the Northern Cross, the cross of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ is all written into that first word of Genesis. And it's pointing to the Northern Cross. And what is between the Sagittarius and Scorpio, but the galactic core. That's what it's pointing to, the galactic core. And they have a book and a video on the earth on fire. And if you study that, Dr. Venet, Paul Violet, he does a good job in making that discovery. So it's not a discovery I made as he did, but I saw the same thing in the first chapter of Genesis. Here you go into the red part of this design, and you'll see it goes into the second, third, and fourth chapters of Genesis, where it talks about Cancer and Leo. Well, that is the total eclipse of the sun, the second chapter of Genesis. And the third chapter is Virgo. The fourth chapter is Libra. The first discovery I ever made in the Bible, the first discovery, was that the first chapter of Genesis went into a cycle of 9 parts. It took me 20 months to figure out it was a 12-part cycle. And then it took me another 9 months to discover that it had to do with astrology. Even though initially I had the idea it was astrology, I just rejected astrology because the Catholic Church rejected it. And then I realized after almost 6 years that astrology dominated the symbolism of the Bible. No, I do not believe in fortune telling or any of that nonsense, but I do believe that astrology has to do with numerology and mythology, or symbolism of mythology. And so the second, third, and fourth chapter of Genesis has to do with the Eleusinian mysteries and the Mitra mysteries and the Masonic order and that kind of stuff. And not that it's wrong, because my first discovery, that cycle I told you about, led me into a system of 1,584 cycles, which led me into 11 basic cycles out of that 1,584. Those 11 cycles split into 2 parts. The scales of Libra. And who holds the scales of Libra but Virgo holds the scales of Libra. So and that's just the first and second chapters of Genesis holds those 2 scales. And the third and fourth chapter of Genesis is Virgo, what am I saying? Virgo holding the scales of Libra. So it's interesting that all of this is codified into the first 4 chapters of Genesis. And I've written over 29 articles, independent academic articles, discussing all these things that we're talking about. And so I just don't say this thing on your radio. I can't show all these papers or go into detail of my discoveries. But if you read those papers, you'll see the details, arguments that I give explaining those discoveries. Let's go into the 28 image now. Here I take the universal mathematical matrix, the matrix of wisdom, and I show that if you walk out the door of the house that you live in, on the street that you live in, you're literally living in the city of Jerusalem, come down from heaven. There are 2 houses on each side. Then you got the sidewalk with the telephone poles and lawn, and then you got the traffic going through the center. You got water, air, earth, and life. The life is you. So even the Matrix is telling you that you're always living in the Garden of Eden. You're living in heaven, but you could also turn it into a hell, which when that spiritual sheen leaves you, you're living in hell. And trying to get that sheen back, that spiritual sheen back, that would be purgatory. Let's go to image 29. Image 29 takes the universal mathematical matrix, the matrix of wisdom, and it breaks it down into its numerical code. As you can see, the blue image of the matrix is 1 and 8. The yellow is 2 and 7. The red, 3 and 6. The 4, 4 and 5. Earth, air, fire, and water. The 4 mystic elements of the universe, which create, these are the 4 gospels. These 4 colors, these 4 images represent the first 4 days of creation. This is the light. That's why the gospels, the 4 gospels, that light, they represent light, Christ, because they're all talking about the life of Christ. It's telling you that Christ is the light that comes out of the first 4 days of creation. So again, what I show here, a little below in the patterns in the matrix, is the Kabbalistic tree of life and the Star of David. Now, here is where I began to fully understand that this matrix wrote the Bible. And how I did that is I noticed that the 4s and 5s, as you can see, the 5s, the 4s 4s and 5s are the color green, they create the Star of David. But all the 4s and the 5s in between the Star of David represents, when you look at the first chapter of Genesis, you're going to see that there are 6 Elohims that literally create the Star of David. But look at the space between those points of the stars. There's 4 Elohims or there's 5 Elohims, and it perfectly matches that pattern. And plus the Kabbalistic tree of life and the natural ray, that proved to me beyond a doubt that the Bible was written by this matrix. The ancients saw this matrix, they discovered that matrix. Now, you may say, well, let me go on to below and then I'll get back to that. Now, below that, you'll see that it's a three-dimensional space when you look at the numbers 1. Or you can do it with the numbers 8 too, but you can see it's actually giving you an image of a three-dimensional space. The last final image is the Pythagorean multiplication matrix. I found that in Thomas Taylor's book of 1817. So it's not something I came up with, but even Pythagoras understood this matrix. And look at these first 4. These are the 4 points of the dot, the line, the angle, and the circle of Pythagorean mathematics, of the Tritacus. So all of the ancient cults around the world, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, give you an example. The Chinese created their I Ching and the Tao Te Ching from this matrix. Mm-hmm. The Buddha created their stupas from this matrix. The Hindus and the Christians built their temples and churches based upon this matrix. The pyramids were based upon this matrix. The Indians, North American Indians, and South American Aztecs and Mayans, they all knew of this matrix. In fact, what my greatest discovery of this matrix, you'll see in a minute, was that Washington, D.C. is literally built on this matrix. And we'll see that in a minute. Well, now we're going to image 30. Image 30 shows you the Kabbalistic tree of life, again in the Star of David, in a larger image of this matrix. But so it can be studied more. Now we go to 31. Here's what I did. I took the matrix of wisdom, which is the center matrix here, and it's all color-coded. And all around the central image, the other 8, are all in white. And I did that to symbolize them as the stars of heaven. Now, where I got the idea of doing this was that the first verse of Genesis has 28 letters. Well, if you look at these side by side, these matrices, all the 9s are in black. And you can barely see the 9s, but the 9s are there, right? So if you count the spaces, there's 29 times 29, and when you turn it into three-dimensional reality, it's 28 times 28 times 28, and that color matrix in the center would disappear because it would be surrounded by a galaxy of stars. Now, what I did then was I turned around and says, okay, if I multiply 28 times 28 times 28, I come up with 21,000 and a couple of hundred. I can't think of the exact figure, but it's over 21,000. But that is very, very close to the precession of the equinoxes, 25,920. You say, well, why jump into the precession of the equinoxes? Well, when you subtract the number here, 21,300 something from the 25,920, you get 6,968, something like that. But when you divide the precession of the equinoxes, 25,920, into that 6,000, you come up with 0.153, the Vesica Pisces. So what is this matrix telling you? It's telling you that the spiritual powers of God are beyond the material universe that you see. They're beyond your raison d'etre. So it has nothing to do with your raison d'etre. It's only when you attune yourself to those outside forces, the spiritual forces of the universe, beyond the universe, and they come into your universe, it'll smash your universe into pieces and give you new raison d'etre, a new life to live on this earth, and you will have a life more abundant, as Christ says in the New Testament. Now we're going into image 32 and 33. Image 32 is an image of the house of the temple in Washington, D.C. It's the house of the Masonic order. And as you can see in the center on top, you can see the Holy of Holies right there in the center. Well, if you count the amount of pillars, it's 10. If you go around the building and count all the pillars, there's 10 on the north side, south side, east side. It's the 10 by 10 matrix. They build their temples on this matrix. If you look at the floors of the Masonic orders, as they're calling it the checkerboard, they think that's cute. A lot of people that don't know masonry. I'm not a mason. In fact, I refused to go into Masonic order because I was afraid they were going to stop me from revealing my research. So, but the point I'm trying to get at is the Masons then took their concept of this 10 by 10 matrix that the whole world knows about, and they created Washington, D.C. back just right after the Revolutionary War. In fact, Thomas Jefferson wrote to the governor of Virginia asking him to succeed a certain amount of land so that they can complete this 10 by 10 matrix. Maryland and Virginia. As you can see, the Potomac goes down the center, not the center, but a small portion. If you do the geometry on that Potomac, you'll get the golden ratio. Mm-hmm. That's the ratio of the two lands of Virginia and the Potomac. No, Maryland and the Potomac against Virginia. Now, the secret name of Washington, D.C., well, you got Virginia, the Virgin, right? Mm-hmm. Then look at Maryland, Mary, Virgin Mary. Maryland used to be called the Aqua Terra, Terra Aqua, land by the sea. And then they changed it to Maryland in order for them to get that secret name embedded into Washington, D.C. But the land that Virginia succeeded to Washington, D.C. was given back to Virginia. I guess the virgin aspects of democracy just went out the window. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So now you've got the Mary there, Aqua, or the waters of creation. Hey, let me show you some interesting things about our country and about the symbolism Mason turned it into. We have a Congress of 535, right? Mm-hmm. The first chapter of Genesis has 434 words, right? Mm-hmm. Well, 434, the first word is actually two words, meaning separated 6. 435, which is the aggregate of 29. 29 is symbolic of of Saturn, Chimera of Saturn. But the reason why I brought it up is that the matrix, 10 by 10 matrix, is 100. 100 and 435 gives you 535, or the amount of people in the Senate and the House of Representatives, 535. Why that's interesting is that if you look at the words light and darkness in the first chapter of Genesis, light has 207. Well, darkness gives you the Gematria value of 328. 328 and 207 is 535. So that's what you're going to get out of Congress, either light or darkness, or, the psyche. Uh-huh. Well, we'll get into the psyche in a second. But as you can see with these maps, you can go on the internet and look at the maps of Washington, D.C., and this is what you're going to come up with in image 33. And it mirrors the house of the temple right there in Washington, D.C. Now we go again to Chartres Cathedral in image 34. I show this image of Chartres because the right tower represents the moon. Mm-hmm. The left tower represents the sun. And the sun is 365 feet tall. And the sun, the moon tower, this is Boaz and Jacob, the tower, the columns that are outside of the Masonic temples. Mm-hmm. They cannot go inside the temple, the male and female, until they're mystically married. And the only way they're mystically married is when you get to the Vesica Vices, as you can see with that Christ image I showed you earlier with the Vesica Vices in Chartres Cathedral. The whole center of Chartres Cathedral on the west facade, there was a Hindu priest came one time, and he looked up there and he was studying the central columns and the Christ on top and all these different aspects to the bottom. And he saw that these were the 7 light chakras of Hindu mythology. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, this is the west facade. This was built before the rest of the Gothic cathedral. The Gothic cathedral is basically what the purpose of it is to show that all the stone statues they represent me, you, and every other human being on the face of the earth. We are the Torah. The
Mm-hmm.
Torah comes out of our head. So we are the granite block that we got to constantly pound on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the stone statues telling the stories of the Bible all around Chartres Cathedral. Now you go to the windows, and they tell the same scriptural stories in those stained glass windows. So when you realize that that's light going through that glass is the spiritual interpretation of the granite rock. You got to get the water to come pouring out of that rock.
Right.
You know, one of the interesting things about the west facade is that the gigantic rose window is actually the same size as the labyrinth on the floor of Chartres Cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
But Chartres Cathedral, the labyrinth is not the same as a maze. The labyrinth has a one path going every which way but loose, chaotically. You go east, west, north, south, here, there, and everywhere. But you end up by going through the same path. You go right to the center.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a maze, it's all about you. It's you choose the way to go. And there are so many different paths to take that you could very well lose your mind going through a maze.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Mm-hmm.
difference between a maze and the labyrinth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was glad to see that the amount of blocks that make up the matrix is the amount of days that a child is incubated as gestated in the womb of the mother.
Interesting.
Yes, a lot of people don't know that, but that's neither here nor there. It's people should study, and don't stop studying. Image 35 again is a very interesting thing about the Kundalini serpent and the Vesica Pisces, because here the matrix I show the Vesica Pisces in the matrix. I do this to image the um, St. Peter's floor plan, and they actually have an image where you can with every single one of those faces represent. You hit the link and you go right to that site. There's over 100 sites here, and it's beautiful. I actually have a set of books here, 4 books, worth over $2,000 just on the St. Peter's Basilica, showing every single site. So you can see I study very in detail these sites, and that's where I begin to see the patterns. The Holy of Holies is supposed to be 15 feet by 15 feet, and it hit me. What happens if I check every one of those feet off as a different block? Let me see what will happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I did that, I realized that it came to 3 times 64 and 1 times 32. Again, 3.5, representing the dormant Kundalini,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what the Holy is. It represents Christ consciousness, the Kundalini rising. And you could see the 2 circles here below in the blue and red and white area. And when the 2 circles come together, they're concentric circles. But when they come together and they intermix, you could see the dynamics of the tetrahedral forces of creation, into so called chaos. That's what goes on in your mind right now. You got nothing but chaos in there, and your ego is the discriminator.
Mm-hmm.
It discriminates of what I want to say or what you want to say, right? You just can't have it come flooding out like a tsunami, or otherwise you'll be in the insane asylum.
Right.
Basically, that's the whole process of the tetrahedral forces, the Star of David. That's what it represents. So now we go to the light chakras. As you can see, the image of the light chakras, I only put that there because of right next to it is the image of Chartres Cathedral showing you the 7 light chakras. In fact, I have a film on Chartres Cathedral. They made it very expensive online now. Um, but it literally shows you that guy describing the Chartres Cathedral and the 7 light chakras. It's really beautiful. Um, when you really find where the real source material came from. Image 36 is the 36 deacons of the zodiac, and I put that image there to show you that those 36 nines around the central aspect of the matrix of wisdom could very well be those 36 deacons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Give you number 37 is it's a beautiful image because when I did Dante Alighieri's mathematical system, that's where I discovered the matrix of wisdom. And it was from his work that I was able to go forward, and I made that final discovery in 1994. Um, so I take these 12 final figures that I come up with in Dante's, and I put them into the area graphics program on the Microsoft Excel, not Excel, but Microsoft area graphics program. And that one line image created this image of the Trinity, the silhouettes of Trinity images. As you can see, the light image shows two images. If you turn it upside down, it shows you one face. Turn it the other side, it shows you the other. And a dark image shows you like a Neanderthal man, like the ego or Yahweh, Yahweh in the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to bring that out that this is so mystically hidden. And Dante, it was only at the end of all my mathematical studies, and I finally put that into the Excel program, the area graphics program. But the point is that if you read Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy and you go from the beginning to the end, it's only at the very end of Dante's journey through the three mystic realms is he left alone by Saint Bernard, and as he's left alone in this mystic rose, he has this vision of the Trinity. And notice how at the end of my mathematical studies, I too came up with the image of the Trinity. It's amazing how that came about. In image 38 and 39, I took those 12 figures and I put them into the circle, and up comes the Star of David. It's a beautiful image. And I was going to use this as a cover of my book, but I never did use it. I used another image. I did use the black and white image instead of the color one. The skeleton, the supporting mathematics in creation, I gave it that name because I saw the mathematics as a skeletal structure to the Bible. Never did I realize when I gave it that name that I actually would discover the skeletal structure of the human body in the first chapter of Genesis. I won't go into it, but it is in the fifth and sixth days of creation. It's beautiful. It's absolutely magnificent. But the Bible is always giving you different examples of the spiritual vision that comes to the soul.
Mm-hmm.
As we go to 40, remember that Camilla of Saturn I told you about?
Mm-hmm.
Here it is. I remember when I was a young boy, I was only about 15 or 16. My father was in the Marine Corps. He was an MP. And he came home one day with a brain teaser. And he says, Bill, my sister Agnes, and my brother Dennis. And he said, I want you to sit there and I want you to take the first 9 numbers and I want you to put them into a tic-tac-toe box, use each number once, and all columns and all rows and the diagonals have to add up to 15. So we sat, and about 10 minutes later, I gave my father the answer. Oh, no, you got it wrong, he says. Remember, he worked on it all day at work.
Uh-huh.
He gives it to me, and I got it in 10 minutes.
Uh-huh.
Well, here it is, almost 30 years later. I had to reach back to that memory to help me understand Dante's mathematics. And it turned out that Dante did use that matrix, right? It's amazing how things that happen early in your life, you're reaching back to help you understand the latter part of your life.
Correct.
You know? And
now,
my
what's the significance of the 15 on every side?
I don't think it's the only thing that's interesting. It may represent how the dimensions of the Holy of Holies. I don't know. The 15 may not mean anything, but it does mean that it's a perfect matrix. That's what it's in. There are only 7 of these, right? 7 magic squares,
Mm-hmm.
one from 3 to 9, and then after 9, it's all redundant. If you understand what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
So there's only the 7, and they represent. This represents Saturn, and the other ones represent the other planets,
Mm-hmm.
the Sun, Moon, and Venus, and Mars, and whatever. So here you go into image 41. As you look at image 41, you can take the Camilla of Saturn And when you go from line to line, like you got the siegel of Saturn, which is the known signature of this matrix, of this magic square. Then you got what they call the neutral swastika. When you go from line to line on the male and female swastika, you create a fish symbol for Christianity, the scarab of Egypt, or the clothing or housing or architecture of the Chinese. So you can see where those images originated from.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody has ever seen that before I made that discovery. Then I turned around and researched that Khmer even further, and I discovered the original of the I Ching and the Tai Chi symbolism. All came out of this matrix. Because this matrix, this 3 by 3 square, is a mini image of the 10 by 10 matrix. If you remember the 10 by 10 matrix, it separated off into a 3 by 3 square. Now here you see the origin of the square, compass, and G in Masonic symbolism. That's where they got their symbolism from.
Mm-hmm.
It's magnificent that you can see all of these different patterns all coming out of the first chapter of Genesis, because when you study the first chapter of Genesis, you'll see it's talking about nothing more than the matrix. The matrix is the only thing it talks about.
Mm-hmm.
Wisdom. That's what it's talking about. Because, as I said, all of our speech, all of our numbers and letters and ways that we express ourselves are meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
Really. What you exude from that is the most important aspects of it. It's how we live our lives. It's what we base our lives on. For example, let me give an example of uselessness. Around the world, there are hundreds of different languages. Me and you speak English. I don't know if you speak another language. But if you go listen to a Spanish person, or you speak to an American Indian, Navajo, or a Spanish person, or Swahili, or go to Africa, or go to Italy, or any country around the world, you hear them speak, and it's the gaga prattle of a newborn baby.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I talk about. That's what language is, the gaga prattle of a newborn baby. Mm-hmm. It's our way of trying to express ourselves. So if we don't live in France, they're going to have a different way of expressing that gaga prattle, and they now call it French. We call what we have English. Mm-hmm. The American Indians call that what they have. The point is, it's the gaga prattle. It's meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
Because unless you understand it, you don't know what is being conveyed to you.
Right.
And the same thing with art. You go into the Sistine Chapel. I never been to the Sistine Chapel, but I wrote a 484-page paper on the Sistine Chapel. I broke the code of the Sistine Chapel. I showed that all the frescoes come together in a unified system, explaining the spiritual nature of Catholicism. But a lot of people don't realize that the Masonic, what am I saying, the Masonic order? The Catholic Church, the Sistine Chapel, has the same dimensions of Solomon's Temple.
Mm-hmm.
It's 3 times squared. Now, that 3 times square, if you can image it in your mind, 3 squares, mm-hmm. and then you take the sides and you morph it out and let the two, the north and the south, come forward, you'll create an octagon shape.
Mm-hmm.
That's what St. Peter was. If you look at Christ giving the keys to Peter, in the background is an octagon shape. It looks like a gazebo mm-hmm. that you see in many parks, the octagon shape of a gazebo. But that octagon shape is the Khmer of Saturn, with just the corners cut off. But if you look at the center of that matrix, it's the cross. It's the cross of Christ, because it's all odd numbers. Mm-hmm. Only the corners are even, meaning even represents female, represents infinity. Mm-hmm. Right? Where the center, the cross, it represents ego consciousness. It represents distinction. It's like you creating words to speak.
Right.
Finally, the last image, 44, we come across the Fibonacci sequence. I put this in my book the last month, just before I was about to publish the book on the Sistine Chapel. I made this discovery, and I wanted to copyright it right away, so I put it into the book, showing that it comes out of the matrix, really, that the DNA, the chromosomes of your body are based upon this symbolism of the Fibonacci sequence and of the matrix. I took the Fibonacci sequence and I kept going out. And after 24, I was reducing it to the lowest common denominator. And after 24, I realized that it was repeating itself.
Mm-hmm.
Every 24 calculations was a pattern. The 24 chromosomes, sets of chromosomes of the body. I know there's 23, 46, but the extra two represent the male or female. That's why it's only down to 23. But if you look at it and you go out, I initially in my book I have pre-examples going out to 72 calculations, and I show that the presets it's the same pattern. So you can see I'm the first since Fibonacci came up with that discovery. The last time somebody made a discovery on the Fibonacci sequence was every 60 there was a pattern. So here I show that it may have to do with the DNA structure of the body. Maybe that may help the scientists define it more perfectly. I don't know if that will help or not. But anyway, that's basically it to show you that the mysticism of the Bible, it begins with the first letter and it goes out to infinity itself. And it doesn't stop. Every moment of our lives is based upon the Word of God.